In the autumn of 1965, the Thompson family of four vanished without a trace from their white clapboard house on Maple Street in the village of Blackwood, Vermont. Their disappearance would have remained just another unsolved case in the files of the Vermont State Police, if not for what investigators found 3 months later: a hidden room beneath the First Congregational Church containing personal belongings of the Thompson family, along with detailed journal entries describing rituals that had been officially banned by early Puritan laws and later by mainstream Protestant churches centuries ago. The strangest part, the final entry was dated 2 weeks after the family was reported missing. For nearly 60 years, the church has refused to comment on the discovery. The Thompson house remains abandoned to this day, windows boarded, doors locked, no trespassing signs repeatedly torn down and replaced every autumn. What makes this case even more disturbing is that when investigators finally gained access to sealed diocesan records in 1985, they discovered that the Thompson family was not the first to disappear under these mysterious circumstances. Tonight I will reveal what really happened in that quiet Vermont village based on documents that have never been made public until now, including testimony from the only surviving witness who has finally agreed to break more than 40 years of silence. Before we continue with the story of the Thompson family and their connection to the First Congregational Church, this is not a story for everyone. This channel is only for those who are willing to look at the darkest corners that most people prefer to keep hidden. If you are one of those true mystery seekers, subscribe now and let me know in the comments what state or country you are listening from. Very few channels will tell you the stories we tell here. Stories that entire towns, churches, and sometimes even state authorities tried to bury forever. Now let us step back into the autumn of 1965 and see what was really happening in Blackwood, Vermont. Blackwood was the kind of small New England village where time seemed to move more slowly than in the rest of the world. The ancient stone walls and clapboard houses held memories of more than 2 centuries of continuous human habitation. Nestled deep in a narrow valley in the Green Mountains, surrounded by hills that turned brilliant red, orange, and gold every fall, it was home to barely 300 people, most of whom could trace their families back 5 or 6 generations within the same handful of surnames. The village centered around the First Congregational Church, a tall, white-steepled building that dominated the small valley. The church had been built in 1791 on the site of an even older gathering place. Local stories claimed the hill had been considered sacred long before the first European settlers arrived in Vermont. The autumn of 1965 brought an unusual early cold to Vermont. The leaves changed color sooner than anyone remembered, and the colors were so intense they almost looked unnatural. A thick fog began settling over the valley every evening at sunset, clinging to the church walls and the old gravestones like something alive. Robert Allen Thompson was a man whose days ran like clockwork. At 39 years old, he had inherited both his careful habits and his job as postmaster from his father before him. Every morning at exactly 7, he left the house on Maple Street, wearing a pressed shirt, carrying his old leather satchel. He walked his 2 children, Sarah Elizabeth, 11, and Caleb James, 8, to the village school before going to the post office to sort mail and handle packages. For the whole valley, Robert was quiet and kept his thoughts to himself. People who knew him described him as deeply religious in the old Vermont way, faithful, practical, not showy. He served as a deacon at the church, and every Sunday morning he made sure the hymn books were neatly arranged and the collection plates were clean. His faith was as steady and dependable as the mountains around the village. Eleanor Grace Thompson, née Whitlock, had come to Blackwood as a young bride 14 years earlier. At 36, she still had the same striking beauty that had caught Robert's eye at a church social years before. Her dark hair was always neatly pinned in a practical style. She ran their small house with the same careful order that ran through the whole Thompson family. But Eleanor had a restless side, a deep curiosity about the world that sometimes clashed with the conservative ways of the village. She loved local history and folklore. She spent many hours reading old books and documents. In the backyard, she kept a garden full of unusual herbs and plants that older villagers recognized from their grandmothers' stories. Plants that had once been used for purposes no longer spoken about openly. When neighbors asked about her garden, Eleanor would smile and say she just liked keeping the old traditions alive, though she never explained exactly which traditions she meant. The Thompson children were the pride of the little village school. Sarah Elizabeth was serious and thoughtful. She was always at the top of her class and helped her mother without complaint. She had her mother's dark hair and her father's calm nature, but teachers sometimes noticed she seemed older than 11, as if she carried some heavy knowledge for her age. Sarah loved reading books about history and old stories. She often sat in the churchyard copying inscriptions from the oldest gravestones into a notebook she carried everywhere. Caleb James, called Caleb by everyone, was the village's favorite little boy. At 8 years old, he had a bright laugh and endless curiosity that made every adult in Blackwood smile. He was especially fascinated by the church building. He spent hours looking at the carved wood details and asking questions about the colored glass windows. Lately, he had been drawing constantly, filling pages with pictures of the church, the hills, and, as autumn went on, increasingly strange images that his teacher did not know how to understand. The village of Blackwood lived by patterns that had been set long ago. Saturday was market day in the little square beside the church. The general store was the place where news traveled and opinions were formed. The post office also served as a package drop-off point. The one-room school taught children from 5 to 14 before they went to bigger schools in nearby towns, but under this peaceful surface, Blackwood held secrets that went back many generations. The village had always been cut off, not just by geography but by culture. The old families, Whitlocks, Aldens, Hargroves, Bishops, and a few others had kept traditions and knowledge that outsiders almost never saw. They married within a small circle and passed down information only to certain chosen people. That is where the story truly begins. In 1965, Blackwood had 312 residents. The same families that settled the valley after the Revolutionary War still owned most of the land. The Whitlocks, Aldens, Hargroves, Bishops, and a handful of other names appeared again and again in birth, marriage and death records going back to 1789. The town was deliberately isolated. There was no interstate highway. Only one narrow road came in and the same road went out. In 1965, telephones were still rare in most houses. The outside world felt very far away. The people of Blackwood were proud of this separation. They called their valley God's country. They said outsiders brought trouble. They believed the old ways were better than anything new. The first Congregational Church stood at the center of everything. Built in 1791, it replaced something much older, a place where native people had once gathered long before any white settlers arrived. When the first families came, they removed the old stones and built their church on the same spot. But what lay beneath the ground was never really removed. The Thompson family lived in the last house on Maple Street, the final building before the Woods took over completely. Robert Thompson, 39, had been postmaster for 12 years. He was a man of routine, career veteran, quiet, dependable. He never talked about the war. He came home, married Eleanor, raised 2 children, and lived a life that looked completely ordinary. Eleanor Thompson, 36, taught 3rd grade at the village school. She was intelligent, well-read, and curious. She had a backyard garden full of strange plants, mugwort, wormwood, henbane, things most Vermonters had never heard of. When asked, she said they were for old family teas. Sarah, 11, was an excellent student and piano player. She already stood taller than most boys her age. She carried a notebook everywhere and filled it with drawings of the church. Every carved detail, every window, every crack in the stone foundation. Caleb, 8, was the child everyone loved, always smiling, always asking questions. He said he could hear voices in the church bell when the wind blew just right. On paper, they were the perfect small-town American family. But in the fall of 1965, something began to change. Eleanor started staying late after school, saying she was preparing lessons. Robert missed the Thursday night card game at the VFW, the first time in 11 years. Sarah stopped playing with the other children and spent hours in the churchyard copying old Latin words she should not have understood. Caleb began drawing the same picture over and over. Hooded figures standing in a circle around a stone table, with something small and pale lying on top. The school teacher sent a note home in mid-October. Robert came alone to the meeting. He looked like he had not slept in days. Eleanor has been reading about local history, he said. She joined that new group, the Blackwood Heritage Society. They meet in the church basement. It's just old books and stories. Nothing to worry about. The teacher remembered how pale his face became when he said the word stories. By late October, the whole village could feel something strange in the air. The evening fog was thicker than anyone remembered. The church bell sounded different, deeper, almost like it came from underground. Old Mrs. Whitaker, who lived across from the church, said she heard chanting at 3 in the morning one night, and children's voices were part of it. She closed her curtains and never spoke of it again. On Sunday, October 31st, 1965, Halloween, the Thompsons attended morning service as usual. The Reverend's sermon that day was strange. He spoke about covenants older than Scripture and obligations that cannot be refused once they are accepted. He looked directly at the Thompson family's pew when he said, "Some families are called, and when they are called, they must answer." After the service, the family walked home quickly. They did not wave to anyone. They did not speak to anyone. At 2:17 p.m., the man who ran the general store watched them enter their house and close the door. By nightfall, all the lights in the house were off. That night, some people later reported seeing lights moving behind the church. Some said they heard children singing, Sarah and Caleb's voices. The singing stopped around 3:30 a.m. The next morning, November 5th, Robert Thompson did not open the post office. By noon, the state police were on their way. What they found inside the house was worse than any crime scene they had ever seen. The table was set for Sunday dinner. Plates were washed and put away. Robert's wallet was on the dresser. Eleanor's purse hung on its usual hook. Sarah's school books were open to Monday's homework. Caleb's toy cars were lined up neatly on the windowsill. Everything looked perfectly normal, except the family was gone. On the kitchen table under the salt shaker was one sheet of paper in Eleanor's handwriting. It said only, "The old covenant must be honored. We were chosen. Pray for us." That is where the official story ends. But that is where our story is only beginning. Because 3 months later, in February 1966, a Vermont state police sergeant found the hidden stairs behind the altar of the First Congregational Church, and everything the town of Blackwood had tried to keep buried for more than 200 years came into the light when Sergeant Frank McAllister of the Vermont State Police finally entered the First Congregational Church with a warrant in February 1966. He already knew something was deeply wrong. The initial search of the Thompson house had found no signs of struggle. No blood, no forced entry, nothing that pointed to a normal crime. The family had simply vanished, leaving everything behind as if they had planned to return in 5 minutes. But the note on the kitchen table, "The old covenant must be honored. We were chosen. Pray for us," kept coming back to him. During the first walkthrough of the church, McAllister noticed something strange about the layout. The space behind the altar seemed deeper than it should be. The wall felt too thick. When he measured the outside of the building against the inside rooms, there were gaps, empty spaces that didn't match any known basement or storage area. He returned with a small team, a tape measure, and a flashlight. They tapped on the wooden paneling behind the altar. One section sounded hollow. It took them almost an hour to find the mechanism. A small iron ring, hidden behind a decorative carving of a vine, pulled outward. A section of the wall slid aside with almost no sound, revealing a narrow stone staircase going straight down into darkness. The steps were worn smooth in the center, as if hundreds or thousands of feet had passed over them for a very long time. At the bottom of the stairs was a circular chamber carved directly out of the bedrock. The room was about 30 feet across. The walls were covered in carvings. Some looked like early Christian symbols. Others were much older, spirals, crescent moons, interlocking geometric patterns that no one in the room recognized. In the center stood a large block of black stone, clearly much older than the church above. Its surface was uneven and stained with dark patches that looked very old. Around the stone were the remains of recent use: melted candle wax, dried bundles of herbs, small metal bowls containing what looked like ash and salt. But what made Sergeant McAllister's stomach turn were the personal items. Eleanor's wedding ring lay in the exact center of the stone block. Robert's pocket watch, still ticking, rested beside it. Sarah's blue hair ribbon had been carefully folded and placed at one corner. Caleb's favorite red Matchbox car sat at the opposite corner. The items were arranged with deliberate care, like offerings on an altar. Scattered around the chamber were notebooks and loose pages, dozens of them. Most of the recent handwriting belonged to Eleanor Thompson. The journals began in early 1964 when she first joined the Blackwood Heritage Society. The early entries were normal, excited notes about local folklore, quotes from old Vermont history books, sketches of plants and their traditional uses. But as the months passed, the tone changed. By late 1964, she was writing about deeper truths and forgotten wisdom that the modern church had lost. She described meetings in the basement where Reverend Alden read from very old manuscripts, books that were kept locked away and never shown to outsiders. In the spring of 1965, the entries became more intense. She wrote about practical demonstrations of old seasonal ceremonies. She said the group believed these rituals were necessary to maintain the balance of the valley. She described feeling a powerful presence during the ceremonies, a sense of being watched, of being chosen. By summer 1965, she was convinced that certain families in Blackwood carried old bloodlines that had a special responsibility to keep the traditions alive. She wrote that the Thompson family had been quietly selected for something important. The final entries, written in October and early November 1965, were almost feverish. She wrote about signs and portents, unusual birds circling the church steeple, dreams where voices spoke to her, feelings of being guided. She said Reverend Alden had explained that the time had come for the harvest observance, the ritual that required a complete family unit and could only be performed on certain dates when the veil between worlds is thinnest. Her last entry was dated November 14, 1965. It was only one paragraph long. They told us it would be a transformation, not an ending. They said we would become eternal, that the valley would be protected forever because of our sacrifice. But when the moment came, I saw their faces. Alden, Hargrove Bishop, and I understood too late. The covenant does not protect the town. It feeds on it. And now it is hungry again. Sergeant McAllister read those words in the dim light of the chamber and felt the temperature drop even though no windows or doors had opened. He ordered the room sealed and called for more investigators. What they found next would show that this was not a single crime. It was part of a pattern that had been running for generations. When the police began reading the older journals hidden under loose stones in the floor of the chamber, they discovered handwriting from many different people going back to the 1920s. The earliest entries were written by Reverend Samuel Alden and the great-grandfather of the current Reverend who led the church in 1965. Reverend Samuel Alden had discovered the hidden chamber during repairs in 1923. At first he wrote about it as an exciting archaeological find in an old root cellar or storage room from before the church was built. But his entries quickly changed. By 1925, he was writing about strange dreams he had while sitting in the chamber. He described hearing voices that gave him instructions. He said the voices told him the valley had been protected for centuries by a covenant, an agreement, made by the first settlers in 1792. According to the voices, the covenant required a sacrifice every 19 years. A complete family, mother, father, and children, had to be offered so the land would remain fertile, the winters mild, and the village safe from outsiders and disease. Reverend Samuel Alden wrote that he initially resisted the idea, but after several years of strange events, crop failures, sudden illnesses, accidents, he became convinced the voices were real and the covenant must be honored. The first recorded family disappeared in October 1930, the Carter family. They were newcomers who had moved to Blackwood only 3 years earlier. The official story was that they had decided to return to Massachusetts for better work. But Reverend Alden's journal described the ceremony in detail, how the family had been prepared over months, slowly drawn into the Heritage Society, which at that time was called the Valley Preservation Group, convinced that they had been chosen for a sacred role. The journal described the final night. Candles, chanting, herbal mixtures added to wine, and then the moment when the family realized what was happening, too late to escape. After that first ceremony, Reverend Alden wrote that the valley had the best harvest in 20 years and no major illnesses for 3 winters. He believed it worked. The pattern continued. Every 19 years, another family vanished. 1930, Carters. 949, the Millers. 1968, the Thompsons. Though the cycle was slightly adjusted in 1965 due to urgent signs, each time the story was the same. The family had moved away suddenly. found better opportunities elsewhere, left no forwarding address. Each time the church and the old families closed ranks, the house was cleaned, the belongings quietly divided among trusted members, rumors were spread, and questions were discouraged. The journal showed that the Blackwood Heritage Society had existed under different names since the 1920s. It always started as a harmless history and folklore group. Then slowly, certain members were invited to deeper meetings in the hidden chamber. Only people who showed the right combination of curiosity, spiritual hunger, and willingness to obey were brought in fully. By the time a family was chosen, they had been conditioned for years. They believed they were doing something noble. They believed their sacrifice would protect everyone else. Eleanor Thompson's journals showed exactly how that conditioning worked. She had started with innocent interest in local plants and old stories. Reverend Alden gave her rare books. She felt special, chosen. She began to see signs everywhere. She convinced herself, and eventually her husband and children, that they had a sacred duty. Robert had resisted longer than most. He had gone to Reverend Alden in September 1965 to express concern. He left that meeting shaken. The journal does not say what was said, only that Robert came home pale and told Eleanor they won't let us leave. The police now understood why so many people in Blackwood had been evasive. During the initial interviews, many knew something, some knew everything, but fear, loyalty, and generations of habit kept them silent. When Sergeant McAllister began bringing people in for questioning with the journals as evidence, the wall of silence finally cracked. The next part will cover the confessions, the trial, and what happened to Blackwood afterward. Armed with the journals from the hidden chamber and the physical evidence on the black stone altar, Sergeant Frank McAllister started bringing people in for formal interviews. The first person he questioned, again this time with photocopies of relevant journal pages in front of them, was Dr. Margaret Bishop, the village doctor who had practiced in Blackwood for almost 30 years. Dr. Bishop had examined Robert Thompson twice in October 1965. At the time, she had told police that Robert was suffering from severe anxiety and insomnia, and that he had mentioned family pressures. She had refused to give more details, citing patient confidentiality. Now sitting across from McAllister, with the pages open to her own handwriting from 1950 and 1968, she could no longer hide. The journal entries showed that Dr. Bishop had been present at 4 previous harvest observances. She had prepared herbal mixtures to calm the chosen families. She had signed death certificates afterwards stating natural causes or sudden illness, certificates that allowed the bodies to be quietly buried in unmarked graves in the old cave system beneath the hill. At first she denied everything. When shown her own words describing the 1949 Miller family ceremony, she broke down. She told McAllister that she had not wanted to hurt anyone. She said she truly believed, for many years, that the ritual was necessary. She said the valley had unusually good weather, low crime, and almost no serious disease outbreaks for decades. She believed the covenant was real, and that refusing it would bring disaster to everyone. She explained how the process worked. The Heritage Society would identify a family that fit the pattern, usually one with at least one adult who already showed interest in old traditions, and preferably newcomers or people without close relatives outside Blackwood. They would invite them slowly into the group. They would give them rare books, private meetings, feelings of being special. They would create a sense of destiny. By the time the final ceremony was suggested, most people were already convinced they were doing something holy. Dr. Bishop said Robert Thompson had been the hardest to bring in. He had started asking questions in September. He had threatened to leave the village. Reverend Alden had told him that leaving would break the covenant and bring harm to the entire valley, including his own children. When Robert still resisted, they decided to move faster. They used stronger herbal preparations in the wine served during the final meeting. They made sure the children were already deeply involved, so Robert would not leave without them. Dr. Bishop cried when she described the night of October 31st, 1965. She said the children had been told it was a special family ceremony, a way to become closer to God and the land. They had been calm at first. Only when the chanting became louder and the knives appeared did Sarah and Caleb start to cry. She said she could not watch the end. She left the chamber before the final act, but she signed the false records afterward. Next came Mrs. Evelyn Hargrove, the town librarian and keeper of most of the old documents. Mrs. Hargrove denied involvement for 2 full days. Then McAllister showed her photographs of items found in her attic, a silver locket that had belonged to Mrs. Miller in 1949, a child's drawing book with the name Carter inside the cover, a small wooden box containing jewelry from at least 3 different families. She finally admitted she had been keeping the record since 1947. She said it was her job to make sure the story stayed consistent. She wrote letters from the missing families to distant relatives. She forged signatures on change of address forms. She spread rumors about new jobs in Boston or Burlington. She said she never took part in the actual ceremonies, but she knew exactly what happened. She said she believed it was the only way to keep Blackwood alive. When asked why she never told anyone, she said, "If I spoke, they would have taken my children next. And then my grandchildren. The covenant does not forgive silence breakers." The third major break came from Reverend Paul Alden himself. When police arrived at the parsonage with an arrest warrant, they found him sitting at his desk burning pages from an old ledger. Most of the papers were already ash, but enough survived to show names, dates, and payments made to families who helped clean the houses afterward. Reverend Alden was calm at first. He said the journals were metaphorical and spiritual allegories. When shown Eleanor Thompson's final entry, the one that said, "The covenant feeds on it," he became very quiet. After several hours of questioning, he began to speak. He said the covenant began in 1792 when the first settlers were starving after a brutal winter. They made a pact with something they believed lived under the hill, something that demanded a family every 19 years in exchange for protection. He said his great-grandfather had rediscovered the chamber and the instructions in 1923. He said every reverend since then had carried the responsibility. He claimed he had no choice. He said if he refused, the entire valley would suffer. Floods, blizzards, disease, economic collapse. He said he had tried to make the process as gentle as possible. He said the families were always drugged so they would not suffer too much. He said the children were told they were going to a beautiful place. When asked why Eleanor's last entry called it a lie, he looked away and said, "She saw too much at the end. Some of them always do." The trial of the Blackwood conspirators began in the summer of 1960 at the county courthouse in Burlington. It was one of the most shocking cases Vermont had ever seen. The prosecution presented the journals, more than 40 volumes covering 1923-1965, physical evidence from the hidden chamber, forensic analysis of the altar, stone showing human blood residue from multiple decades, testimony from 6 people who had been peripheral members and finally decided to speak, medical records that Dr. Bishop had falsified over the years, letters and documents forged by Mrs. Hargrove. The number of confirmed victims was horrifying. 17 complete families, 68 people in total, had disappeared between 1930 and 1965. Entire bloodlines wiped out. Children as young as 3, grandparents in their 80s. The bodies had been placed in the natural cave system beneath the hill, network of tunnels that had been used for the same purpose since at least the 1920s. Forensic teams recovered remains from more than a dozen different years. Many showed signs of having been drugged before death. The children's remains were the hardest for investigators to examine. Many had evidence of terror right up to the moment they died. The defense tried to argue that Reverend Alden and the others were mentally ill, suffering from shared delusion caused by isolation and old religious texts. Court-appointed psychiatrists examined Alden for weeks. They concluded he was legally sane. He knew exactly what he was doing. He planned every step carefully. He manipulated people with skill and patience. Dr. Bishop and Mrs. Hargrove received life sentences. Reverend Alden was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder because of his position as a religious leader and the scale of the crimes. He was sentenced to life without parole. Several other people, those who had helped clean houses, spread rumors or kept silent knowing the truth, received shorter sentences for obstruction of justice and accessory after the fact. The trial destroyed Blackwood. Within a year, most families who were not charged left the village. Property values fell to almost nothing. The general store closed. The school lost all its students and shut down. The post office moved to a neighboring town. The first Congregational Church was deconsecrated by the state diocese in 1967. The building stood empty for 2 years before it was demolished in 1969. The hidden chamber was filled with concrete. The hill was planted with grass and left alone. The Thompson house remained empty until it was torn down in 1972. Nothing was ever built on the lot again. By 1975, Blackwood had fewer than 40 residents, mostly elderly people who had nowhere else to go. The village that had existed for almost 200 years became a ghost town. The case changed how missing persons investigations were handled in rural areas. New rules were made about checking church and community records. Clergy oversight became stricter. Police were trained to look for patterns instead of accepting they moved away. Stories at face value, but for the people who had lived there, the damage was permanent. Many who stayed silent for decades suffered from guilt and nightmares for the rest of their lives. Some required long-term therapy. Some never spoke about Blackwood again. The most frightening part was not the murders themselves. It was how normal church-going, respectable people had slowly accepted something so terrible and kept doing it for more than 40 years. After the trial ended in late 1966, Blackwood was no longer the same place. Most families who had not been arrested or directly charged left within the first 12 months. They sold their houses for almost nothing or simply walked away and let the bank take them. The ones who stayed were mostly older people, those in their 70s and 80s who had lived their entire lives in the valley and had nowhere else to go. The general store closed in the spring of 1967 when the owner moved to Rutland. The post office was officially relocated to a neighboring town by the end of that year. The one-room school had no students left by September 1967 and was boarded up. The last church service in the First Congregational Church was held on Christmas Day, 1966, attended by only 9 people. In 1969, the diocese ordered the church building demolished. They said it could never again be used for worship after what had happened inside it. A small crew came in with heavy equipment. They tore down the white steeple first. Then the walls came down. The hidden chamber beneath the altar was filled with truckloads of concrete. The entire hill was leveled slightly and covered with grass seed. Within 5 years, the village looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Roads cracked and filled with weeds. Houses lost their paint and their roofs began to cave in. The maple trees along Maple Street grew wild and blocked most of the old house numbers. The Thompson house stood empty until 1972. Then a local contractor was paid to tear it down. The lot was left as bare ground. No one ever built on it again. By 1975, only about 35 people remained in Blackwood. Most were widows or widowers who had lost sons, daughters, or grandchildren in the earlier disappearances. They rarely spoke to outsiders. When reporters or true crime writers came to ask questions, they closed their doors and pulled their curtains. The state eventually stopped maintaining the road that led into the valley. In winter, it became almost impossible to drive in. The last telephone line was disconnected in 1981. Today, more than 60 years later, Blackwood is considered a ghost town by most maps and local historians. A few crumbling foundations and overgrown stone walls are all that remain of most of the houses. The hill where the church once stood is covered in pine trees and tall grass. If you walk there on a quiet day, you can still see faint outlines of where the foundation used to be. But the real legacy of Blackwood is not in the empty buildings. It is in the people who lived through it, and in the questions that remain. Many of the surviving older residents carried terrible guilt for the rest of their lives. Some had suspected something was wrong for years but never spoke. Others had heard rumors or seen strange lights behind the church and told themselves it was nothing. A few had even helped clean the empty houses or watched children. During the final meetings, they lived with recurring nightmares. They saw faces in their windows at night. They heard children's voices when no one was there. Some went to therapists in Burlington or Montpelier, but most kept silent even in private. The case became a textbook example in criminology courses about how small, isolated communities can hide massive crimes for decades. Professors still teach it as a study in group conformity, social pressure, and the slow normalization of evil. It also led to lasting changes in how churches and rural communities are monitored. The Protestant denominations in New England introduced stricter oversight of small parishes. Background checks for ministers became more serious. Dioceses started requiring annual audits of church records and properties. Police departments in rural states added training on recognizing patterns in missing persons cases, especially when multiple people disappear at once or when the explanation is always they moved away suddenly. Yet even with all those changes, experts still ask the same question. How could so many normal people, teachers, doctors, librarians, Ministers take part in something so terrible for so long? For more than 40 years. One person who had been inside the chamber many times refused to speak publicly. Her name was Abigail Whittaker. In 1965, she was 24 years old, the youngest adult member of the Blackwood Heritage Society. She was the daughter of old Mrs. Whittaker, the neighbor who had heard chanting and seen lights behind the church on Halloween night. Abigail had been brought into the group when she was 19. She had always loved old stories and local history. Reverend Alden told her she had the right kind of mind for deeper research. She started by reading the locked books in the church library. Then she was invited to the basement meetings. By 1964, she was attending ceremonies in the hidden chamber. She was there on October 31st, 1965. She stood in the circle while the Thompson family was brought down the stairs. She held one of the candles. She repeated the chants. She watched Robert Thompson struggle when he finally understood what was happening. She saw Sarah and Caleb crying. She saw the knives. Afterward, she helped carry the bodies to the cave entrance. She helped wash the stone altar. She helped burn the blood-stained cloths. For the next 40 years, she said almost nothing. She moved to Burlington in 1968. She worked as a clerk in a library. She never married. She never had children. She lived alone in a small apartment. In 2009, when she was 68 years old, she contacted a true crime researcher who had been writing about unsolved disappearances in Vermont. She said she wanted to speak once before she died. She wanted to say what she had seen. In a series of taped interviews conducted over 3 months in 2009-2010, Abigail Whittaker told the full story. She said the group genuinely believed they were protecting the valley. She said the first time she saw a ceremony, she was so frightened she almost ran. But Reverend Alden told her that doubt was the voice of evil trying to break the covenant. He told her that if she left, her mother would be the next one chosen. She said she stayed out of fear. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She stayed because after a few years she began to feel numb, as if what was happening was no longer real. She described the night the Thompsons died in detail. She said Eleanor looked straight at her just before the end and whispered, "You'll remember this, and one day you'll have to tell it." Abigail said she never forgot that moment. She said it haunted her every single day for 44 years. She said the worst part was not the killing itself. The worst part was how ordinary the evenings became afterward. People went back to work. They went to church on Sunday. They smiled at each other in the store. They acted as if nothing had happened. She said the covenant did not protect the valley. It poisoned it. It turned good people into silent accomplices. It turned a beautiful place into a place of fear and shame. Abigail Whittaker died in 2012. She left her tapes to the researcher with one condition. They can be made public only after I'm gone. The Blackwood case did not end when the last sentence was handed down in 1966. What happened in that small Vermont valley became a permanent warning, one that criminologists, psychologists, sociologists, and religious historians have studied ever since. The most disturbing fact was not the number of victims, 68 confirmed over 35 years. It was how ordinary the perpetrators were. Reverend Alden was not a wild-eyed fanatic. He was a polite, well-spoken minister who wrote thoughtful sermons and visited the sick. Dr. Bishop was respected for miles around, the person people trusted when their children had fevers or their parents had heart trouble. Mrs. Hargrove was the quiet woman who helped children find books and always remembered birthdays. They were not monsters from the beginning. They became monsters slowly, one small compromise at a time. The process always followed the same steps. Start with something harmless, a local history group, a book club, a folklore study circle. Create a feeling of being special. You understand things others don't. Introduce small rituals, candles, chants, shared wine, presented as cultural tradition. Gradually raise the stakes. This is bigger than us. It protects everyone. Use fear to keep people in line. If you leave, the valley suffers, or your family will be next. Make doubt feel like betrayal. Only weak people question the covenant. Normalize the violence. It's not murder. It's transformation. It's necessary. By the time the chosen family was brought to the chamber, most participants had spent years convincing themselves they were doing something good. They had already lied to neighbors. They had already forged documents. They had already stayed silent when people disappeared. Each step made the next step easier. Psychologists who studied the case later called it Incremental moral disengagement. People do not jump from good to evil in one step. They walk there one tiny step at a time, and each step changes how they see themselves. The isolation of Blackwood made it worse. No major roads, no regular visitors. Very few people ever moved in or out. When you live in a place where everyone knows everyone, and everyone is related to someone, speaking out means losing your entire world. That is why Abigail Whitaker waited 44 years before telling her story. That is why so many others took their secrets to the grave. The Blackwood case showed something frightening about human nature. In the right conditions, almost anyone can be slowly turned into an accomplice to terrible things and still go to church on Sunday, smile at their neighbors, and believe they are good people. It also showed how dangerous, unchecked, authority can be, especially when that authority wears a collar and stands behind a pulpit. After Blackwood, many denominations in the United States and Canada introduced new rules. Mandatory background checks for anyone serving in rural or isolated parishes. Regular inspections of church properties, including basements and outbuildings. Confidential reporting lines for parishioners who feel pressured or unsafe. Training for ministers on recognizing signs of cult-like behavior inside religious groups. None of these rules can completely prevent another Blackwood, but they make it much harder for something like it to grow in secret for 40 years. The story of Blackwood, Vermont is now more than 60 years old. Almost everyone who was an adult in 1965 is gone. The children who grew up hearing whispers about the disappearances are now in their 60s and 70s. Many of them left the state and never came back. Yet the questions remain. Could something like this happen again today in a small town? In a remote valley, in a close-knit religious community? Could a group of normal people slowly accept something evil and protect it for decades? The answer most researchers give is yes. Modern versions would look different. They might use online forums instead of church basements. They might hide behind wellness retreats or ancestral healing circles instead of heritage societies. They might speak in the language of spirituality, manifestation, or saving the planet instead of old covenants. But the psychology would be the same. The slow grooming, the feeling of being chosen, the fear of what happens if you leave, the shared secret that binds everyone together. The moment when violence starts to feel like a sacred duty, Blackwood reminds us that evil rarely arrives wearing a mask and laughing. It arrives quietly. It arrives wearing familiar faces. It arrives wearing a clerical collar, a doctor's white coat, a librarian's cardigan. It arrives with a reasonable explanation and a promise of safety. The only real protection is simple and hard at the same time. Question everything, even when the person speaking has known you your whole life. Stay connected to people outside your immediate circle. Trust your own eyes and your own conscience more than any group or tradition. Speak when something feels wrong, even when everyone else is silent. The Thompson family never had the chance to do those things. Neither did the Carters, the Millers, or any of the others who vanished every 19 years. But we do. That is the only real ending this story has. If you ever drive through a quiet valley in Vermont, or anywhere else, and something feels just slightly off, listen to that feeling, because sometimes the most dangerous places are the ones that look the most peaceful. Thank you for listening to the full story of Blackwood, Vermont. If you want to support this kind of deep, unfiltered storytelling, subscribe and turn on notifications. Tell me in the comments, have you ever visited or lived in a small town that felt strange in ways you couldn't explain? Have you ever felt pressure to stay silent about something that didn't feel right? I rate every comment. Until the next mystery, stay curious, stay questioning, and stay safe. End of series.